If you listen to modern financial commentators, the history of money is a simple story of a tragic fall from grace. They paint a vivid picture of a semi-mythical golden age when money was honest and tangible. According to this popular narrative, the classical gold standard was a perfect, self-regulating economic machine. This machine supposedly brought unprecedented prosperity, global harmony, and absolute price stability to the world. This nostalgic fairy tale always culminates with the exact same clearly identified villains. Greedy politicians and power-hungry central bankers are blamed for deliberately murdering the gold standard. Supposedly, they committed this crime so they could print endless fiat money for endless wars and massive welfare states. It is a morally satisfying story of political betrayal and economic original sin. But this narrative is fundamentally, historically, and economically wrong. The true origin of the gold standard's collapse is not a simplistic story of political assassination. What is the tragic story of a brittle, inflexible, and fundamentally flawed monetary system? This system was mathematically doomed to fail in a modern, rapidly industrializing world. The gold standard was not destroyed by the malicious stroke of a single politician's pen. It was utterly obliterated by the mechanized slaughter of world wars. It was crushed by the weight of massive sovereign debts and catastrophic physical gold shortages. It was killed by the arrogant, suicidal attempts of powerful nations to protect wildly overvalued currencies. Today, we are going to completely dismantle the powerful mythology of the classical gold standard. We will expose the hidden, brutal mechanics of a monetary system that relied on immense human suffering. And we will show you exactly how the gold standard committed suicide. It died long before any politician officially pronounced it dead on a television broadcast. To understand the collapse, we must first understand how the system was supposedly designed to work. And we must look at its historical peak, stretching from the 1870s to the summer of 1914. The underlying theory of the classical gold standard was beautifully simple and logically consistent. Every participating nation defined its domestic paper currency as a specific, fixed weight of physical gold. Because every major currency was rigidly tied to gold, they were perfectly tied to each other. This created a seamless global system of mathematically fixed exchange rates. If a country imported more goods than it exported, it ran a trade deficit. That country had to physically ship gold out of its vaults to pay the difference to its partners. As physical gold left the country, its domestic money supply would automatically shrink by law. According to economic logic, this contraction would cause domestic prices and wages to drop significantly. Eventually, the country's manufactured goods would become incredibly cheap on the global market. Other nations would start buying those cheap goods, and physical gold would flow back into the country. The economic balance of the world would be magically and automatically restored. This is the famous price-specie flow mechanism, the theoretical heart of the entire ideology. But what the economic textbooks fail to mention is the brutal human cost required for this adjustment. For prices to drop quickly, wages had to drop immediately across the entire country. And for wages to drop, factories had to be shuttered and businesses had to fail. Millions of workers had to be thrown into the cold streets to starve. The classical gold standard did not magically balance national economies through invisible, painless forces. It balanced them by periodically inducing severe, agonizing deflation and mass unemployment. This ruthless system only worked because the vast working class had absolutely no political voice. There were no effective labor unions and absolutely zero social safety nets to protect them. When gold left the country, the poor and vulnerable simply suffered in silence until balance was restored. Furthermore, this widely romanticized era was not a natural, spontaneous, free market utopia. The classical gold standard was secretly managed and constantly steered by one dominant financial superpower. The Bank of England acted as the global conductor for this sophisticated golden orchestra. The entire system relied entirely on an incredibly fragile geopolitical balance. It required an era of unprecedented global peace, free movement of capital, and British imperial dominance. But in August 1914, that fragile world order was violently blown to pieces by artillery guns. The First World War is the true defining beginning of the end for the gold standard. Total industrialized war and physical gold are fundamentally incompatible with each other. Gold is a physical element strictly limited in its tangible quantity by geology. But total mechanized, state sponsored war requires absolutely unlimited amounts of money to function. When the massive conflict erupted, the principal combatant nations instantly realized a terrifying truth. They simply did not possess enough physical gold in their central bank vaults to pay for the war. They could not afford the millions of artillery shells, rifles, and mobilized soldiers required to survive. Faced with the choice between losing the war or abandoning their economic principles, they chose survival. Every major European power immediately suspended the gold standard by emergency decree. They locked their central bank gold vaults shut and made it illegal to convert paper money into gold. Then they turned on the printing presses with unprecedented and desperate fury. Governments issued staggering amounts of paper currency and completely unbacked debt instruments. This was the only way to finance the relentless industrialized slaughter in the trenches. This uncontrolled printing of money caused massive, crippling inflation across the entire European continent. It permanently detached the value of paper currencies from the physical gold that was supposed to back them. By 1918, the classical gold standard was dead in Europe, abandoned entirely in practice. When the guns finally fell silent on the Western Front, the global financial landscape was unrecognizable. The once mighty European empires were physically and financially ruined. They carried sovereign war debts so massive that they dwarfed their entire national economy. The United States, meanwhile, had accumulated unprecedented amounts of the world's physical monetary gold. They did this by selling weapons, food, and supplies to the desperate allies during the conflict. The old, balanced world of 1914 was dead and buried in the mud of Flanders. But the central bankers and politicians of the 1920s stubbornly refused to accept this grim reality. They suffered from a collective, dangerous, and monolithic nostalgic delusion. They genuinely believed that forcing the world back onto the gold standard would solve everything. They thought it could magically recreate the global peace and prosperity of the pre-war era. And they completely failed to understand that the classical gold standard was a byproduct of pre-war stability. It was a reflection of the peace, not the cause of it. This arrogant delusion led directly to one of the most devastating economic policy mistakes in human history. In 1925, Winston Churchill made the fateful decision to return the British pound to the gold standard. Driven by national pride, he insisted on returning at the exact pre-war exchange rate of 1914. He locked the pound at $4.86, a catastrophic and mathematically illiterate decision. Britain had printed colossal amounts of money and suffered crippling inflation during the war. The British pound was fundamentally weaker in real terms than it had been a decade prior. By arbitrarily locking the pound at its old value, Churchill massively overvalued the British currency. This economically suicidal move meant that British exports instantly became vastly more expensive. British coal, steel, and textiles were suddenly uncompetitive on the global market. British export industries completely collapsed almost overnight. The industrial heartland of the country plunged into a brutal, prolonged depression. To desperately defend this artificially high exchange rate, the Bank of England raised interest rates. These punishingly high interest rates strangled domestic British businesses and halted all investment. The British government knowingly kept millions of workers unemployed to crush wages and lower prices. They sacrificed their own working class on the altar of a shiny yellow metal to protect financial prestige. This was a failure of politicians ruthlessly defending a broken, outdated golden idol. But Britain's suicidal monetary policy was only one massive crack in the crumbling post-war facade. A far more dangerous systemic flaw was secretly tearing the entire global economy apart. There was a critical mathematical shortage of physical monetary gold in the world. Because prices and debts had grown due to wartime inflation, the gold supply was simply insufficient, and there was not enough metal to back the new, massively expanded global money supply. To solve this fatal liquidity shortage, the world's financial elites created a mutant system. They established the highly unstable gold exchange standard. Under this new system, smaller countries did not need to hold actual physical gold in their vaults. Instead, they were legally allowed to hold the paper currencies of major powers as reserve. They treated US dollars and British pounds as if they were literally as good as gold. This flawed design created a terrifying, highly leveraged financial pyramid scheme. Multiple nations were basing their entire money supplies on the exact same limited pile of physical gold. This new global system was built entirely on a foundation of blind, fragile trust. It assumed that everyone would never ask to convert their paper currency for gold at the same time. This fragile house of cards was immediately destabilized by purely selfish national policy. It's in the late 1920s, France legally returned to the gold standard with a deliberately undervalued currency. This calculated move made French exports incredibly cheap on the world market. It caused a massive trade surplus that acted like a giant financial vacuum cleaner. It ruthlessly sucked physical gold out of London and into the vaults of Paris. Simultaneously, the booming speculative United States economy was also absorbing massive amounts of global gold. Under the accepted rules, France and the United States should have expanded their domestic money supplies. But France and the U.S. Federal Reserve deliberately refused to play by the rules. They actively sterilized the incoming gold, locking it away deep in their vaults. They prevented it from ever entering their domestic economies, refusing to let their prices rise. By hoarding the world's gold supply, they intentionally starved the rest of the global economy of liquidity. This relentless hoarding created a brutal, unrelenting, deflationary pressure across the entire planet. Other nations were forced to constantly tighten their belts and crush their own domestic economy. They had to do this just to prevent their remaining gold reserves from fleeing to Paris or New York. The gold standard had mutated into a ruthless instrument of international financial warfare. This was the incredibly fragile, severely imbalanced world that existed in October 1929. When the American speculative stock market bubble finally burst, it sent a massive shockwave. It hit a global financial system that was already structurally hollowed out. As panic spread, the rigid mechanics of the gold standard turned a recession into an apocalypse. Frightened international investors completely lost all faith in paper currency and banking institutions. They began to aggressively demand the physical gold that they were legally promised. This psychological contagion triggered a relentless wave of catastrophic bank runs. But the fatal flaw of the mutant gold exchange standard was exposed. The gold simply was not there. There were far more paper claims to gold than there was actual physical metal in the vaults. In 1931, banking collapses in Austria and Germany forced those governments to freeze foreign exchange. The uncontrollable financial panic immediately shifted across the English Channel to London. Investors realized the Bank of England had very little physical gold left to defend the pound. They launched a massive speculative attack, dumping their pounds and demanding gold. On September 21st, 1931, the Bank of England officially suspended gold payments. The psychological impact was equivalent to a global economic earthquake. Dozens of other dependent nations immediately abandoned the gold standard to protect their economies, but the United States stubbornly held on to its vast, hoarded gold reserve. The U.S. Federal Reserve rigidly adhered to the archaic rules of the gold standard. They actively raised interest rates in the middle of a catastrophic domestic economic depression. This suicidal defense of gold forced thousands of solvent American banks into bankruptcy. It was only in 1933 that newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt finally took drastic action. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, making it a federal crime to privately own gold bullion.